Good evening, and welcome back to the Poem Museum. What sort of research notes do you think that the master of the macabre kept in his private files? We'll find out, and we'll see a sample in tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Well, like most authors, Edgar Allan Poe kept a file of personal notes to help him with his writing. And among the things that have survived, things that his literary executor was able to retrieve immediately after Poe's death, was several pages of notes about the moon, which people think might have been Poe's notes for his story Hans Fall, or maybe for his essay The Universe, which later became Eureka. Poe also kept notes on the works of other writers. We have 4 pages here of notes that he kept on the works of Shakespeare and Milton, that things that Poe probably wrote when he was 20, but he still had with him when he died at the age of 40. So we like to imagine that he probably already had notes about the murder of Mary Rogers, which became the inspiration for his story, The Mystery of Marie Roget. He probably also had newspaper clippings and magazine clippings, things that would have helped him along. But among the few things that survive, and that survived because his literary executor picked them up, we know about the moon notes, we know about the notes on Shakespeare, and we also know that Poe kept a lot of notes on reviews of himself and his works. So when he couldn't just clip the review out of a magazine or newspaper because it belonged to somebody else, he would just transcribe the positive review because he liked to keep a scrapbook kind of those things. He also kept a list of subscribers to a proposed magazine, along with these weird little jokes, things that Poe thought were funny that his mother-in-law wrote into his little notebook. Okay, I know you're dying to hear one of those really bad jokes that Poe's mother-in-law wrote in his account book. Here's one. If a stove costs $20, what will a ton of coal come to? Ashes. That's the joke. He probably also kept some autographs simply because they were the autographs of famous people or letters or correspondence from famous people. So we know that he had a letter from Elizabeth Barrett Browning thanking him for dedicating his book, The Raven and Other Poems, to her. And he used to whip out that letter from time to time and show people, hey, I've got a letter from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the great British poet. But he also would have had letters from Charles Dickens. And we know that Poe valued autographs because he wrote a whole series called Autography, where he pretended he could analyze handwriting and he wrote about different autographs. So in addition to these, here's another piece that he had, which is a piece that Poe didn't write, which is one of the reasons it's so interesting. So here it is. And I mentioned to you that Poe collected notices that other authors wrote about him. And this is a long review of Poe's very early book, written when he was 20 years old, called Al-Araf, Tamerlane and Minor Poems. His first book, Tamerlane, published when he was 18, wasn't even distributed. So a couple years later, he tried again. And this time, to help promote the book in advance of publication, he sent samples of his poetry to different editors and reviewers. One editor wrote back and actually published this about how much he enjoyed seeing this young poet's work burn up in the fireplace, these sickling lines that Poe had written. But then there's another one, a Boston editor named John Neal, who is a pretty well-known editor and poet who is editing the Yankee, and Poe sent him a letter and a sample of his poetry saying, I'm young, I'm not yet 20, but, I give the world to be a poet, to give birth to just half the ideas afloat in my imagination. And rather than make fun of him like the other critic did, Neal actually printed some of the poems in there and said how great they were. He said that this young poet might make a beautiful and perhaps magnificent poem. There's a good deal here to justify such a hope. And for the rest of his life, Poe said those are the first words of encouragement he'd ever received. After rejection followed upon rejection, heartbreak following heartbreak, those words spurred him on, and he did get that book, Al-Araf, published. So Neil wrote this really pretty flattering review, and we can tell this is Neil's handwriting. It's not Poe's handwriting. And there's the only thing here in Poe's handwriting is actually the words John Neil right here, labeling who it was. And there's lengthy quotations from Poe's early poems like Sonnet to Science there. There's Romance right here. So this was a pretty good review. We don't know exactly what happened with this review because Neil sent it in for publication. And part of it did appear in a national magazine, the Ladies' Magazine Literary Gazette, that was edited by Sarah Josepha Hale. You should know who Sarah J. Hale is. She's the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb. Some people say that she stole the poem. I'm not buying it. She's also the first female in America to edit a national magazine. So very important, very prominent figure in the American literary landscape. And somebody who helped out Poe along the way. She was the first one to publish his story, The Assignation, which was also called The Visionary. She published The Cask of Amontillado. But here, with this long review, she took one look at it and apparently said this is too long a review because she only published the first few sentences and then she edited to the last of those sentences. So whereas Neil was saying how great Poe was, she ended the last sentence, the first paragraph. The author, who appears to be very young, is evidently a fine genius. But she added, but he wants judgment, experience, tact, which that last part doesn't appear in here. He doesn't say that Poe lacks in judgment. He says this guy is going to produce no less a poem than Shelley, Percy Shelley could have written. So, yeah, she sort of did him dirty. But whether this review was intended for that magazine or not, we don't know because we never found the rest of it. But that's all she printed, not all the rest of the glowing praise. So what happened to this? This is a mess. Look at this thing. I mean, they've crossed out the reviews that Neil wrote of others, and then when you get to the other page, you'll see his handwriting's inconsistent. You know, you've got some passages that start up here, and then they go down here, and the little line leads you, back over here. Then this one reads top to bottom, these one reads side to side, then this is top to bottom again, and it's just all over the place. And I actually had to transcribe this, and a lot of it really is just squiggly lines. And Poe himself would agree with me because he wrote in his series autography that I told you about Neil's handwriting, and he said, Mr. Neil's manuscript is exceedingly illegible and very careless. It is necessary to read one half of his epistle and guess at the balance. The capitals and long letters, like those of Mr. Palfrey, extend far above and below the line, while the small letters are generally nothing but dots and scratches. Many of the words are run together so that what is actually a sentence is frequently mistaken for a single word. One might suppose Mr. Neil's mind, from his penmanship, to be bold, excessively active, energetic, and irregular. And that's what I get from this manuscript. It's a bunch of squiggles and dots and dashes, barely legible. So you kind of have to read half of it, guess the rest, except for, the part that Poe wrote right there, which is very legible. So that's how we can tell that it's not Poe's handwriting here. And it's also how we can tell this is probably a rough draft. The finished legible draft that Poe turned into the magazine where he wanted to get it published, the magazine probably kept it, and once the typesetter had typeset everything, threw it out, didn't need it anymore. So that means that Neil was left with this, and he probably sent this to Poe, because by this time Poe and Neil were writing back and forth. And portions of this review, the rough draft, appear in an 1843 newspaper article about Poe. So Poe probably supplied these quotations for that article so they could write nice glowing things about and say, oh, John Neal wrote this about me, and that John Neal wrote that about me. And Poe kind of brags about the great things that Neal has written about him. So this is the kind of paper that Poe held on to and kept for the rest of his life, probably because of his devotion to John Neal. They remained friendly for the rest of their lives. And even after Poe died, we have a letter in the collection that Poe's mother-in-law wrote to John Neal's wife. So they try to keep those lines of communications open. So this is the kind of thing that Poe had in his private files. But what do you think? What other things do you think that Poe was keeping in his private files? Was it notes about premature burial? Or decomposition of bodies? Let us know down in the comments what you think. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces, like these valuable pages from Poe's private files, why not support the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us. I leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.